ready to start our meeting, Belarus political conflicts and the war in Ukraine. And with us today to enlighten us on topics concerning Belarus and the whole security situation, the whole political change we've seen since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we have three experts. We have Claus Mathisen from Denmark. He's an expert on all things Russian and Belarusian and many more things. He's an associate professor at the Danish Defense Academy and has been working as a military attaché at the Danish embassies in Warsaw and Kiev. We have Alicia Rudnik. She is Belarusian from Grodno. She is a PhD candidate in political science at Karlstad University. She's with us from Stockholm, from her home there. And she's a research fellow at the Belarusian think tank Center for New Ideas. And also we have Karin Petersen. He's a journalist and author, and he works at the office of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. She's the leader of the Belarusian democratic government in exile. So we have excellent sources to tell us about what is going on and what the situation is, not only in Belarus, but also for Belarusians elsewhere. And we'll start with you, Claus Mathisen, and you've promised to very briefly give us an idea of what kind of country Belarus is, how the war has affected it, and what kind of political situation we see today. So the microphone is yours. And you need to put on your sound. You've been muted.
I'm unmuting. Here we go. Well, time is limited, so I'll go directly into it. First of all, I would say that Belarus is not only probably, but the country which has the closest relations with Russia of all former Soviet republics, maybe of all countries in the world. Belarus was a co-founder of the Commonwealth of Independent States back in December 91. Belarus is a member of the first Collective Security Treaty back in December 93, and then the Collective Security Treaty Organization since its formation in 2003. Belarus is with Russia in the so-called Union State, which was established in the second half of the 90s. But I should add to this, this Union State for many years had a very little substantial content. I'll return to that. Belarus is member of the Eurasian Economic Cooperation since 2001 and later member of the Eurasian Economic Union since 2015. And Belarus even has a status as observer in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization since 2015. So there are many, many formal ties. There are also traditionally close cultural ties with Russia. There are some 600,000 Belarusians living in Russia. The history is interesting, but I'll definitely not go into details about that. I'll just say that today's territories of Belarus were included in the Russian Empire during the partitions of Poland last time in 1795. It's a country of about 200,000 square kilometers. There are some 9 million inhabitants. Let me say a few words about the Belarus-Russia relations. Before 2014, Belarus was important to Russia as a counterweight to the developments in Ukraine. And at the same time, before 2014 and especially before 2020, Lukashenko attempted to conduct what I would call to some degree independent foreign policy. Belarus invited China to make investments in Belarusian infrastructure. And at the same time, Belarus tried to keep the level of cooperation in the framework of the Union State as low as possible. And at the same time, at several occasions, Lukashenko offered Belarus as a mediator in different conflicts, including the conflict in Donbass. That's why they are called they were called the Minsk Agreements. Anyway, Belarus is mainly important, in my view, to Russia from a military strategic perspective. Belarusian territory has always been the main territory of Russia's war with the invaders from the West. And thus it is simply unacceptable to Russia that Belarus could become a member of the European Union, or not to mention NATO. This has become, I would say, even more evident after the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine a year ago. And my last comments will be on the presidential elections in 2020, which were rather fatal to the fate of Belarus. It was obvious that it was the Russian support that saved, so to speak, Lukashenko's life as a head of state of Belarus. The opposition was suppressed and partly forced to leave Belarus. Russia has intensified the realization of the possibilities included in the Union State framework since that moment, and this also includes many military aspects where the ties have been very much strengthened. There were exercises taking place in the Union States reaction forces in February 2022. Belarus, as a matter of fact, became part of the conflict as Belarusian territory was used for the invasion. Belarusian airspace and territory continue to be used by the Russian armed forces, and Belarus provides supplies, ammunition, and equipment to the Russian armed forces. Belarus provides training of mobilized Russian personnel and units at this moment, and at this day, Russia has at least 10,000 troops, more or less on a permanent basis, placed in Belarus. So, to finish my short introduction, I would say, to me, it's very, very hard to see how Belarus, under these circumstances, can distance itself to Russia. This will probably only happen in case of a full collapse and change of regime in Russia. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for that introduction, Klaus. And you can all ask questions and follow up on some of these points later on. But now we'll shift to you, Alicia Rudnik, and you've been working with the Belarusians fleeing to Sweden as a president of the Belarusians in Sweden, and you do research on all the things we talk about here. So could you tell us a bit about who you are and what you're working with, and what kind of community these so-called relocants or people from Belarus living abroad, what are they doing and what can they do?
Thank you, Rasmus. First, I'll start with a small background that I think is important to what I'm going to be saying. So I was born in Grodno in Belarus, and then moved to Vilnius to study in the university that is called as the University in Exile, that was pushed away by the Belarusian authorities because of political reasons. So I studied political science there, and then I moved to Sweden, where I have graduated from 2 universities in master programs in political science and journalism. Later, I've entered the PhD program in Karlstad University, where I focus on research in protests and social movements and connection to technological developments, how they're used within the social movements all over the world, but mostly within Belarus and Russia. So, and when I entered the PhD program, I've been already affiliated with the Belarusian think tank, independent think tank, and later it has been moved also from Belarus to Poland, because as many other organizations that were speaking freely about the situation in the country, it was forced to move to maintain its activity and to remain secure, so to say, when it comes to all the people who work there. But also when I entered my PhD program, then the protest in Belarus started. So it was an extremely chaotic period. So I flew to Vilnius first and then to Warsaw, and I was helping out as a political consultant to some initiatives of the Belarusian opposition that have been then in need of forming their political agenda, their teams, because still many people remained within the country. So I can say that I was doing a little bit of consultancy, political consultancy for the Belarusian opposition for a while. And later I had to switch focus again to my PhD. So it's many things on board, and that's the position that I'm I'm going to be talking from a little bit from internal perspectives, because I was the part of the process at the beginning, and then a little bit from expert position and the research position. So when it comes to the situation for Belarusians, let's focus maybe a little bit on relocants, and just a small another background. When I was chairing the organization of Belarusian diaspora in Sweden, which was for 3 years, we have managed to conduct a successful campaign on the name change of Belarus in Swedish. So now it's no longer called Vitryssland or White Russia, but it is called Belarus, which we are very proud of. And I think that has laid a path for continuous cooperation and communication with the Swedish authorities. And even though I'm not longer the part of the board of this organization, I still am very proud of that this has been continuing, and that Swedish Belarusians were able to help those who are moving in Sweden as well. Unfortunately, it's not that easy for Belarusians to move in Sweden, because there are different kinds of restrictions, which I'm not going to discuss here. But overall, if we take Belarusians who have fled the country since 2020, we are talking about the middle class primarily. We're talking about the people who had their stable jobs, their good income, the good connections within Belarus, who were developing and impacting the economy of Belarus. There were the IT specialists, there were businessmen, there were interesting cultural activists. So those were the people who were making Belarus better in a way. And they had to flee because they have mainly took part in protests. And they could afford as well to secure themselves abroad. So we don't really know how many people have fled, but according to different estimates, the number goes up to 500,000, and some name even 1 million, but we're not sure of those numbers. So at least 500,000 or a little more have been moving abroad, and some of them have also moved to Ukraine, which made it very complicated for them to legalize after the war escalated last year. So when they moved to the European Union later last year, it was the second time they're changing home in the last 2 years, which implied also re-registration, legalization problems individually and professionally as well when it comes to registration of different organizations. So this is one thing. The second thing regards the trouble or the problem for those who are joining Ukraine, defense in Ukraine, those Belarusians who are defending Ukraine within the battalions and the other war units. So you know that Belarusians have formed the first national unit in Ukraine that has become the first so-called specific national battalion that has been fighting on the side of Ukraine. And currently, this is the part of the Ukrainian army formally, but still those people face problems when it comes to legalization and the problems that come to, for example, if the person has been killed at war, it's very hard to later transport the body to Belarus because they're formally criminals inside the country, inside Belarus. And recently we have heard about the instances of those soldiers who are fighting in Ukraine. They all have criminal cases in Belarus for defending Ukraine, and their relatives have recently been interrogated and the houses were searched. So it's a lot of trouble for the relatives within the country as well. And of course, the last but not least thing that I think is worth mentioning is that all the Belarusian media are currently that are independent were forced as well out from the country and are currently forced to work from abroad, which makes it much more complicated to obtain information from the ground because there are not really many journalists who work inside the country as it's completely unsafe for them. And many of them are behind the bars. So we're talking about the situation where Belarusian independent media have to communicate somehow to their audiences inside the country without being able to actually have access to the information directly. So this complicates the situation even more. But when it comes to the effects of Ukrainian, the escalation of the war last year, then we're talking about also shift in opinions of Belarusians. So if before we were observing that Belarusians were kind of neutral to Russia, to Putin, now we face the situation when Belarusians have to make the geopolitical choice, and that has led to polarization within the society. So part of the society are openly supporting Russia, part of the society are openly supporting Ukraine. I mean, as much as it's possible to do securely, but this has impacted to the fact that the neutral positions of Belarusians to Russia have shifted because of the war in Ukraine. And currently we are facing the big polarization within the Belarusian society, not only on the internal political matters, but also on the political matters. And very last point that I've already mentioned, that volunteers are fighting in Ukraine, Belarusian volunteers, but also we have partisan or small-scale protest actions within the country where Belarusians try to oppose the war in Ukraine. And you've probably heard about railway partisans, those who were sabotaged the movement of Russian military equipment through Belarus, and they were damaging the railway system so as the trains with military equipment don't reach Ukrainian border. So those people who were caught now, they have got from 22 to 23 years in prison, and they're going to probably spend their whole lives there unless the Russian regime collapses. And Klaus has already mentioned the very important point. I think that Belarusian future is very much, unfortunately, very much dependent on how the war will end and how exactly the Russian regime will collapse and when. Only then we can think of the chances for Belarus to become free.
Thank you, Alicia. And now we're going to hear a bit from you, Karim Peterson. You're working for the Belarusian democratic government in exile, or you could call it the opposition at the latest elections, the politicians behind or with some of the massive protests we saw a few years back. So can you tell us a bit about who they are? Who are you? What are you doing?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And first of all, I want to say that I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very happy to see that so many people have joined. It's always very important for me and the work I'm doing to get as much attention to Belarus as possible. So it's really nice to see the interest that we have today. Maybe a little bit of background about me to start. So I have worked as a journalist for many years, and I traveled in Belarus, but it was actually many years ago, maybe 15 years ago, I came to Minsk the first time. At the time, I was very focused on technology companies there. But I've been following the situation, and I joined the Danish association called Talaka, which is the Danish Belarusian Association, working to support and also to create awareness of what's happening. I'm in the board now. I have been in the board for a year. And then I decided to move to Lithuania. I've been living in Vilnius for half a year, where, as you mentioned, I have been working for the office of Svetlana, the democratically elected leader of Belarus. Right now, I'm back in Denmark, still working for the office. So I have maybe some insight, being very close to these events, and I feel like, even though I am not from Belarus, that it's still very important for us here in Denmark as well to support and to contribute to this situation. That's just a little bit of background. So to go back to your question about what the office is actually doing. So the democratic forces of Belarus have several different components or parts, so to speak. There is the office of Svetlana who won the elections in 2020, we believe, and was forced to go into exile. She's currently living in Lithuania, and the office is very much focused on supporting her. She is traveling basically all the time. Right now, she is in Vienna addressing the OSCE, actually today. Yesterday, she was in Brussels. And her task, of course, right now is to gather support for democratic Belarus, for civil society, human rights defenders, political prisoners. As you probably all know, her husband is a political prisoner as well in Belarus. To increase the pressure on the regime to make sure that the regime, the dictator Lukashenko, is isolated, which we can say that he is pretty much right now. The Western world, with a few exceptions, does not want to have anything to do with the regime in Belarus, and recognizes the democratic forces as the legitimate government, we can say. So that this is part of what we are doing. There's also the United Transitional Cabinet that was established last year, actually on the 2-year anniversary of the elections of 2020, the 9th of August. And the United Transitional Cabinet is working to prepare reforms, to prepare for the transition that we all hope will come very soon to democracy. Basically, you could call its members ministers in a way. They are working in different resorts to support and prepare for the necessary reforms. Of course, there's a long path ahead, changing the system inside the country, even after hopefully the democratic forces will be in power. So a lot of work to do. Another part of the democratic forces is the Coordination Council, which is a representative body. Maybe you could compare it to a parliament in a way. It has the new Coordination Council that was just formed has 115 representatives, and is basically working to make decisions and interact with the cabinet. So these structures currently formed the Office of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the United Transitional Cabinet, the Coordination Council. Of course, they are all working in exile because, as you heard, it is really impossible to have any kind of organized opposition inside the country. Everyone who has been active pretty much is either in exile or in prison now. So the work is happening abroad. It's happening very much directed towards creating international support for the democratic forces, for Belarus, and to make sure that Belarus stays on the agenda. I mean, definitely the situation changed 1 year ago when the war started, and apart from all the support, we heard about the volunteers from Belarus fighting inside Ukraine, the rail partisans and so on. There's a lot of support for Ukraine inside Belarus that you really don't see, because of course right now you cannot openly and take these actions without risking your freedom and maybe even your life. So, but it is there, and the work of the cabinet and the office is directed towards supporting Ukraine, and also to show, which I think is very important, that Belarus, the people of Belarus, are on the side of Ukraine, while the regime has obviously allied itself with Russia. But it's very much about changing this narrative that Belarus is a part of the war on the Russian side, which is not true. It's the regime that has allied itself with Putin, obviously keeping Lukashenko alive. So when we hear about this connection between Putin and Lukashenko, we must also, it's a kind of symbiotic relationship. They depend on each other in some ways. And I would very much agree that we need change in Russia as well to have change in Belarus. But hopefully this will happen at some point. Yeah, that was kind of just a brief summary for me.
Thank you. Very interesting. And now we are open for questions, and you post your questions by writing in the chat that you find at the bottom of the screen, and send your question to Fatma Chapour, my colleague. And while you do that, I wanted to ask you, you've all touched upon it, all three of you, but could you specify a bit, or give us a brief, very short comment on what can the EU do, the European Union do? What can people living in exile do to change society, also change the regime in Belarus? is there any kind of role we can play as the European Union, as neighboring countries, or you as an exile government or people from Belarus living abroad? Would you like to start, Klaus?
Yeah, I certainly think that EU can do things, but on the other hand, you also must be aware that, as a matter of fact, EU has been criticizing Belarus since 1994 and the first elections. And I think we should all recall that there was a moment, I can't remember the exact year, but when there were established, I would say, two groups of neighboring countries to EU, and Belarus was placed in the group with which EU didn't want to really strengthen its relations. So I think that some of the grounds for a good cooperation between EU and Belarus have been lost at an earlier stage. But of course, EU should continue its efforts, but it's always a balance, because we also, there is a danger, there's a risk that if EU does a lot towards the more or less official Belarus, it will be used as a kind of, it would be said that now EU is supporting Lukashenko and the regime. So it's a very, very difficult situation. You really have to consider very well what you will do, and you have to be aware what has happened so far in the EU-Belarus relationship.
Alicia, what kind of influence do you see exile or relocant Belarusians can make?
I think that the deal is very simple. EU and those who are abroad have to continue to put pressure on the Belarusian regime. And there is no longer a risk that something will happen, because we are already in the situation when the worst scenario is happening right away. So putting pressure on Lukashenko is the key, I think. And at the same time, we have to think how to support people who live abroad. And actually, in one of the links that I shared, I talk about 5 things that EU can do. And one of them is to support all the groups that are relocated, and those can be selected by the background of the organization you represent. For example, supporting the journalists that need a lot of support, both financial, legalization, offices, etc. And then support Belarusian political forces that need kind of more people, need more assistance as well. And latest, work on the legalization issue of the Belarusians, because they are facing now a lot of rejections when it comes to asylum seeking, etc. So I would say support the different groups in a way that is accessible to you. And there's always the option to donate to the Belarusian political prisoners' families and to other groups in need that really need just very simple things that we already have. But for example, as a rule, you can donate to the Ukrainian army and to Belarusian political prisoners. That's what I do with at least 10% of my salary, because I think that's very simple, but it's very useful for them.
And Karen Petersen, one of the basic rules of political science is that it's very hard to change a country from the outside. And there's not a track record of exiled governments really having huge influence. So what kind of successes do you see for the work you do? What kind of options do you have to exert influence in Belarus?
Yeah, I agree very much with what was already said about definitely increasing the pressure. I think one of the successes that we can point to is that the regime is isolated. We have a number of sanctions packages now from the EU directed towards the regime. Actually, what is quite interesting in that is that the EU was very slow to react in the beginning. It was only after the Ryanair flight hijacking in May of 2021, which you may all recall, the Ryanair flight that was forced to land in Minsk, that was on its way from Athens to Vilnius, that we really saw action take place. We really saw sanction packages being put in place to target the regime. What I find to be very important is to keep talking and to keep raising awareness and changing this narrative, because I'm afraid that without the work that the democratic forces, that the Belarusian diaspora and different civil society organizations is doing right now, in Europe, in different countries, without this constantly talking about the situation inside Belarus, then we would have a very different narrative. Belarus would be seen as an accomplice of Russia in this war, and as an appendix of Russia in a way. And that's what we keep trying to change this perception that Belarus is actually under, now the term we are using in the office is hybrid occupation, that Belarus is under hybrid occupation by Russia. That we should not see that the people in this country, but in any way, want to be part of this war or in any way want to be allied against Ukraine. So changing this, I also believe that when we talk about the future post-war, somehow reconstruction and so on, it's very important that there is not a lot of hate created between the people of Ukraine and Belarus. That Ukrainians also understand that the Belarusians actually want peace. They do not want to be part of this war. So I think that is a really important task for us to keep talking and doing what we are doing right now, to have this briefing, to make sure that the right information comes out. And of course, putting pressure all the time, getting these sanctions packages, getting support, legalization, as you mentioned, very important topic. Now there's a work on a passport for Belarusians in exile, because of course, when you are living abroad in exile, you cannot go to the Belarusian embassy to have a new passport, because you do not want to have this, you don't know what will happen. So
thank you, Karim. I'll stop you here because we have a lot of questions lining up, and you have an option. Of course, you'll have a possibility to answer some of them. But Fatma, let's have 2 or 3 questions in a row, so we get people engaged.
Yeah, of course. First one is Oksana Didiak. I hope I'm saying that right. If you could go ahead and unmute your mic.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, it was right. Oksana Didiak. I represent Kharkiv, Ukraine here. I'm the PhD fellow from Kharkiv National Pedagogical University, doing my research in political science. And of course, I represent the University of Copenhagen, Tours. Well, my question was partially answered because it was the same question as Rasmus has asked. But the second part, well, how can we, Ukrainians, those who are inside of the country and those who are outside of the country due to the war situation, how can we help those parts of Belarus who are not supporting Lukashenko's regime, at least in the means of raising the awareness of what is happening, or using our social media platforms, influencers, or somebody else, or scientists? So as a Ukrainian, I tend to believe that except for the one who wears mustaches and the people who are in his military and intelligence forces, the other part of Belarus society are standing against these kind of military and political decisions we are witnessing now. So how can we help here, if we can?
It's a very good question, Oksana, and nice to hear that you want to help. Yeah.
We do. Живе Білорусь. Yeah.
Fatma, we'll take another question or 2.
Yes, I have 2 questions that actually is in the same lines. Susanne and Uwe also wants to hear about how they can help a resistant movement, on which alleyways and which sites that they can help, and what kind of help the Belarusian needs. Yes, and then Rex, you can go ahead and unmute your mic.
Yes, I'm Rex Schade, in Danish, Schade. Well, my question goes exactly in the direction of what you have already presented. About yesterday, we were trying to figure out how is the resistance in Russia. So I'm very keen on hearing more about how do you evaluate, how do you express in figures maybe the resistance movement? Is it still so that it's the massive against the government?
Very good question as well. I think we'll start with those 2 and pose them to you 3. What can Ukrainians, or an alliance between Ukrainians and Belarusians, accomplish and how? And also, where are the opposition inside Belarus? What kind of resistance can we expect and see? And what kind of sentiments do we see in the Belarusian population? Who would like to start?
I can pick up on the Ukrainian question. First of all, thank you, Oksana, and Slava Ukraini. I'm thinking here that it may be a little complex to put it shortly, but I'll try to give some examples and give some suggestions. So, for example, what happens is that Ukrainian media sometimes censor or kind of put censorship on the news that regards the actions of the Belarusian oppositional movement. For example, yesterday or the day before yesterday, when Biden was talking in Warsaw, none of the Ukrainian media has actually included the quote where Biden praised the Belarusian population. So all the media internationally have quoted the part where Biden said that Belarusians are still fighting for their freedom, but the Ukrainian media. So there is something that's going on here, right? That the reluctance to highlight that there is the resistance. Then there is the second issue, which comes to legalization of Belarusians in Ukraine, and that comes to specifically those who continue living in Ukraine as volunteers, as the part of the Ukrainian army. Many of them don't have papers. So they came there and they live under this directive, which allowed Belarusians to live there without visa. But now this directive is no longer in place and they have to apply for permits, etc. And now it's the time of the war, so it becomes very complicated. But if there are any human rights organizations that can deal with that would be perfect. And then, of course, the most important thing is to prevent and to lobby against any communication of Zelensky office and other political actors, communication of them with the Lukashenko regime, because we know that behind bars there is something happening there and that they talk to each other. And unfortunately, this is something that Belarusian opposition has no access to and cannot influence that. But we know that behind the curtains, the Zelensky office is talking to Lukashenko. And I wish that Ukrainian society could show a little bit resistance to that, even though what is important here, I think we need to remember that for Ukrainians, the goal number one is to win the war and then to think about Belarusians. And Belarusians totally understand that. But if there is something that could be done, that's those 3 points. Thank you.
Klaus Mathisen, could you tell us a bit about what do we know about general opinions on the population in Belarus? Do we have anything like surveys that we can trust? Where are the population on these questions, and what kind of resistance do you see? What kind of options do you see? Because you told us that only a collapse in Russia, of the regime in Russia, will really bring changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Firstly, I would say that I think that one of the ways we from Denmark, with those Danes who want to support Belarus, I think that the idea of supporting the Belarusian unit fighting in Ukraine is, as a matter of fact, rather good. It might be easier to support that battalion than support the opposition in Belarus, which also should be done. It is very difficult to get an impression of how many supporters to the regime there are in Belarus. It's very difficult. As it has been mentioned, quite many active people from the opposition have left Belarus, but I think from time to time we heard, maybe not that much recently, but earlier during the war, we heard about the sabotage actions, the railway actions which were taken, and I think that is very important that the media continue to cover what is going on in Belarus, including also continuing discussing the question, to which extent is Belarus engaged in the war. I mentioned quite a lot, but I didn't mention, because there were no time for that so far Belarus has not entered the war with forces on the ground. And I think it is something which could be more thoroughly discussed, at least, although it's difficult to explain exactly why. But I think it reflects, I don't know about the personal opinion of Lukashenko, but it reflects that I think in the leadership of the armed forces of Belarus, and it may be even more among the common soldiers and in the population, there is a resistance, there is a wish not to be engaged in the war with Ukraine. A good question then is it because that Belarusians don't want to fight Ukrainians, or is it simply because Belarus doesn't want to be engaged in a war? Because I have been to Belarus several times, and one of the things which were stressed constantly is that Belarus has had so much war during its history that Belarus doesn't really want any more wars, not on its own territories, and it will also not engage in any wars there. But these aspects of, let's say, Belarusian official attitude could be more thoroughly discussed and described in the media, I think.
And Karim, could you tell us a bit about how you perceive the struggle for changes in Belarus? Are you up against solely a repressive regime with support from Russia, or do you also fight an opinion, a general sentiment in the population that parts of the population maybe wants to be more in closer relations to Russia than to the EU, or what are you up against?
I think definitely the population is polarized. We have seen some polls earlier. I believe there's a number that's like 86% of Belarusians are against the war, and as was mentioned, I mean, it is of course it's also there's the idea that if Belarusian soldiers were sent into Ukraine, that it would go very badly for Belarus. The country would be isolated for a long time and would risk some terrible consequences out of that. I really believe that the population is divided. More than anything, I think people just want to live in peace, and they want to be on a part of economic prosperity. There's a lot of development that has to happen. We have to remember this is also one of the poorest countries in Europe, so there's a long way to go. The goal, the vision for Belarus is definitely to join Europe, to join the EU at some point. But as we realize, there's a long way to go. So I think personally that the mindset of people also has to change, and that democracy is not something that you can just impose or you can take from one day to the next, but it has to develop really from the ground up. All the way from the education system. So you really have to take it in what democracy actually means, and not to end up just electing another dictator. So a lot of work to do, and definitely people are divided, and it's hard to know exactly what is going on inside the country. But I believe that the majority wants to have democratic change.
Thank you, Karim, and thanks a lot, Alicia, for your very good links for maybe opinion polls we can trust, and some very good comments about how difficult it is to know for sure what the population thinks. We have more questions for you, so we'll hop on to that. Yes, Klaus?
Yeah, just one short comment. I also read the chat here. It says shortly 97% of Belarusians would support Belarus directly joining the war. Is that true? Is that true? Is that what it does? 97% of the Belarusians would not support, or is it just an official poll?
Would not.
Sorry, it was just a mistake.
Now I understand.
Only 3% would support and 97% oppose.
Everything is clear. Thank you. I think we needed to clear that out because it was completely the opposite. Sorry, but it was important to. I was also surprised. It should be a very official poll if that was the result, I would say.
Fatma, let's have some questions, please.
Yes. Bo Vesterlund, if you could go ahead and unmute your mic.
it's about the Russian spring offensive, and we know that Putin wants Belarusian soldiers to participate on the Russian side. But can Putin and Lukashenko force young men to join that offensive? What will they do? Lukashenko, what will he accept?
That's a good question. We'll take another one.
Yes, Lynn or Jensen, if you could go ahead and unmute your mic. Yeah.
It is a question whether there is a Russian minority in Belarus. It's trying to understand the composition in the Baltic countries. There are people who self-identify as Russians. Is there also a group of like that in Belarus, and how large might it be?
Mm-hmm. It's also a very good question. And we'll take a third because we have very many.
Yeah, Nina, if you could go ahead and unmute your mic.
Nina, do you have a question for us? We'll take the next in line and get back to Nina.
Yes, Michael Lauritsen. If you could go ahead.
Hello.
Hi,
My connection. Hello, can you hear me? My connection might be unstable. Okay. Karim, this question is for you, but also for Alicia and Klaus. Karim, when I met you in Vilnius last spring, you said that as an opposition government, opposition in exile, you were a bit careful about being connected too closely to the Ukrainian struggle, because Lukashenko could use it as a propaganda, saying the opposition is just a bunch of Western agents. So you were a bit careful about being connected too closely to the Ukrainian struggle. Is it still so, or has it changed?
Those are three very good questions. So we'd like for you three to give us an answer to whether Russia or Putin can put so much pressure on Lukashenko as to make him send Belarusians into war to join the spring offensive. And the other question is whether there are Russian minorities or minorities identifying as Russians in Belarus. And finally, this sort of dilemma about how closely you can relate yourself to the Ukrainian struggle so as to not to be regarded as foreign agents or traitors in Belarus. I would like to start out. Klaus?
Yeah, I think at least I would give an answer to the first question and something about the second, and I think the two other very kind colleagues would answer the last question. They have probably more background for that than I have. But speaking about a Russian spring offensive, could Lukashenko and Putin force young Belarusians to join the offensive with boots on the ground? That's a very interesting and very good question. I think that theoretically they could, but that would probably need a very, very tough suppression on the armed forces. They would probably have to put quite many young people under arrest. And I have a feeling that, and maybe even worse than that, because you could consider them people who are deserting from the army and under rules of law. There might even be executions and so on. Maybe I would not like to make it too dramatic, but anyway, there are tools which can be used to force young people into war, as we see it in Russia right now. But on the other hand, I have a feeling that Lukashenko is rather reluctant to do that, as I mentioned before, for many reasons, historical reasons, the experience, that Belarus has had so many wars that it doesn't want to get into any wars anymore. And I also think that the Belarus army has a feeling that it is not really strong enough to go into a war with the Ukrainian military, which has been in a war since 2014. and which has been fighting for more than a year with the Russian armed forces and done quite well. And even more, the Ukrainian armed forces are supported by Western equipment and so on. So I think that should the Belarusian armed forces for some reason end up fighting with the Ukrainian armed forces, it would probably be a disaster for the Belarusian army, honestly speaking, with due respect, but honestly speaking. And that is also, I think, some of the considerations which are being made. One thing is that we might not want it for many other reasons, but for a reason that we could be defeated very brutally in Ukraine. I think that is also an argument for not doing it. But theoretically, I think, yes, they could be forced to do it. But I think Lukashenko is hesitating and reluctant and constantly trying to postpone that question, offering almost everything else. Yes, we can train. Yes, you can have our ammunition and so on and so forth. And just about the second question, and then I leave the floor to the other speakers. There is, at least from the official data, there are 7.5% in Russia who define themselves, in Belarus, who define themselves as Russians. Probably mainly living in the eastern regions, Borisov, Vitebsk, and so on, I can imagine. But what influence they have on the situation in Belarus, I don't know, but it is less than were defined as Russians in Ukraine, where it was up to 15 to 20%.
Thank you, Klaus. And Karim, could you tell us a bit more about this dilemma about supporting Ukraine and still having a decent image in the Belarus public opinion?
Absolutely. If I can just give one comment to the previous question, if we would see this situation that the Belarusian army would invade Ukraine on the side of Russia, I mean, the message from the democratic forces is also that they should surrender, that these young men, you know, if they are pushed over the border, they should lay down their arms and surrender to the Ukrainian army. But we could also have a situation where Belarusians would actually be fighting Belarusians, that the Belarusian volunteers inside Ukraine fighting for Ukraine would be fighting the Belarusian army on the Russian side. So, and this would basically could be the start of a civil war. I mean, just to put this out there, that we could have Belarusians fighting each other on different sides here. To the question about the perception that the office is, I mean, it kind of speaks into this whole idea of, as you mentioned, Western agents. That actually the office of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya or democratic forces are not representing Belarusians, but are representing different interests who want to interfere in the business of this country. That's the narrative that the dictator is pushing. So the office has been very careful. And personally, having somebody like me, I can tell you that I'm actually the only foreigner in the office working for Tikhanovskaya, because it should be Belarusians fighting for Belarus, working for Belarus. Obviously, there is a lot of support from the West, and I think that right now there is not this caution about being associated with Ukraine. The office is very much reaching out. Actually, Tikhanovskaya was suggesting an alliance with Zelensky, which was not answered from the Ukrainian side for the reasons that we already heard. So I think there is less of a concern right now about this, but it's very important still for democratic forces that it should be Belarusians deciding the future of Belarus and not people from outside. We are a lot of Westerners who want to help. I'm very honored to be part of that, but in the end, I mean, this is their country and they have to decide the future.
Alicia, do you have some comments to these three questions that you would like to share? And we have just a few minutes back, so if you could say a bit about how you see you call the power division among Belarusians. Who can make the shots? Can civil society gain influence? Is the government all powerful? Do you see openings that the opposition can use to gain influence? So if you could put a bit about that in as well here in the last few minutes.
Sure. I'll just start with a comment on the question whether the Belarusian army will actually try to enter Ukraine. There is this joke and that's the only comment I'll make, that Lukashenko is too afraid to give weapons to his soldiers, because if the Belarusian army gets the weapons, probably instead of going to Ukraine, they will go to his palace and invade this instead. So there is the belief that Lukashenko doesn't trust the loyalty of the Belarusian army. And this doesn't mean that the Belarusian army is loyal to Ukraine. Not, of course, probably not, because they have not had any ties. But there is the suspicion that they might be more loyal to Russia. And that also possesses the threat for the Lukashenko's regime. So anyway, there is this joke around, but I think it has something rightful behind it. When it comes to the chances for the Belarusian opposition, I think that when the window of opportunity comes, whatever it is, either the victory of Ukraine or something happens to Lukashenko's health or the internal political elites behind Lukashenko overthrow him. There are different scenarios, but what matters here is that when the new window of opportunity opens, we probably won't see the same actors who are on the stage right now. So maybe it's not going to be Svetlana Tikhanovskaya who is acting upon this window of opportunity. This might be some groups inside who have been underground, working online with each other, meeting in very close instances. It might be Belarusian volunteers returning from Ukraine to use this chance. It might be the new oppositional groups, or it might be also the old opposition who were active in Belarus in 90s, who started already rise up a little bit recently. So we don't know who those actors are and who'll try to change the situation. But what I know is that it's very important that there is a kind of agreement between the actors that are within this oppositional field on how the potential development after the Lukashenko's regime falls down, how it will be developing, who is going to take the leading role until the first free and fair election, who is going to do what. So I think there is a need of the oppositional forces to communicate to each other right now, because we never know when the new window of opportunity comes, tomorrow or in a few years.
Thank you, Alicia. And now I'll give you 15 seconds each to tell the participants here one thing you think they should take from this meeting and go and tell everybody in the Danish public or in the national public sphere. So Klaus, would you like to start? What is the most important thing for everybody to know about Belarus?
Yeah, I would say that first of all we should have a realistic approach. We should be aware of the ties which are existing between Belarus and Russia, formally and in other ways around. That is one thing. But on the other hand, we should also be optimistic and have hopes for the future that things might change. The possibility of change is probably very much related to changes in Russia. But history shows that certainly something changes, and what we thought wouldn't happen will happen. Let's hope for that, and for as well for Belarus and for ourselves.
Thank you for that, Klaus. Karim, can you tell us one thing everybody should know about Belarus?
So if I have to say it very shortly, I mean, Belarus is not Russia, and Belarusians want to be part of Europe. At least the majority do. That's my firm belief. And yeah, please keep raising this issue. Keep writing letters to your politicians. Write letters to political prisoners to support them. Join Talaka, our organization. We're doing an action on March 3 to support the Nobel Peace Prize winner Ales Bialatsky, who will soon be sentenced to 12 years in prison, probably, even though he won the Nobel Peace Prize in December. So keep talking, keep changing people's perception. But if to say it very shortly, Belarus it's an independent country. It's not part of Russia.
Thank you. And Alicia, do you have one
Thank you.
point to end it on?
Thank you. First of all, thank you for Karim to mention this. Remember, Belarus is not Russia and Belarus is not Ukraine. It's a separate country that has its own interest, and Belarusian population is unique and specific in a way. So remember about this, inform yourself about this. But the most important thing, I think, take the actions from my annoying links that I've sent. Donate to Belarusian political prisoners and support the Ukrainian army, because the quicker Ukraine wins, the more chances for Belarus become open. So please support democracy around the world, but I think not only informed, and also do small actions.
Thanks a lot. And thank you, Klaus Mathisen, for joining us, Karim Petersen and Alicia Rudnick. And now you'll get our very famous Zoom clap, where everyone turns on the microphone and clap. You can't hear us all, but you can feel it. Thank you very much for joining us. It was really, really interesting. And we're going to do follow-ups on the situation, both in Ukraine, in Russia, and Belarus in the coming months. And you can meet us in the countryside, in smaller towns all around the country on our tour with the book and with experts. So thanks a lot for joining us today and at the other briefings. And thanks a lot for you three to take your time to give us all these interesting points of view and insights and analysis on the situation in Belarus. Thank you very much, and hopefully see you again at other meetings where we kickstart democracy and the debate on democratic development in Europe and elsewhere.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.